At its height, the Gothic world stretched far beyond wandering tribes. It reshaped the map of Europe through war, invasion, and the fall of an empire. But how did a people once dismissed as barbarians become a force powerful enough to shatter Rome and redraw the boundaries of the ancient world? In this documentary, we'll trace the Goths' rise through brutal conflicts, shifting alliances, and the military pressures that erupted between the 3rd and 6th centuries. We'll follow their march from the Danube frontier to the gates of Rome, examining the battles, sackings, and wars of migration that toppled centuries-old institutions. Along the way, we'll uncover how these violent upheavals forged new kingdoms, new faiths, and ultimately set the conditions for the cultural transformations that would one day give birth to Gothic architecture. Before we begin, if you're excited to explore how warfare and migration helped lay the foundations for the Gothic Age, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments which part of the story surprised you the most. Our story opens in the cold belt between the Baltic and the Black Sea, where communities moved with herds, traded along rivers, and learned to fight on open ground. Over centuries, these groups coalesced into networks we later called Goths. Lines of kin, war bands, and market routes tied them together more than fixed borders did. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, leaders and followers began to sort themselves into two major spheres. West of the Dniester and along the Danube, the Visigoths formed around chiefs who dealt frequently with Rome. Farther east and north of the Black Sea, the Ostrogoths grew under dynasts who managed trade to the steppe and the Byzantine shore. Language, ritual, and burial customs overlapped, yet political gravity pulled them into separate orbits. Then pressure arrived from the steppe with speed. The Huns moved west, and their shock tactics broke the balance that had held on the frontiers. Communities fled ahead of them. Leaders calculated that Roman territory, though hostile, offered food stores, markets, and walls. In 376, large bodies of Goths sought entry across the Danube. Officials agreed on paper to accept them as foederati, federated allies, while promising rations. Corruption and mismanagement turned the crossing into a crisis. Hunger, insult, and confusion sparked violence. The empire now faced an enemy it had nominally admitted. 2 years later, near Adrianople, an imperial army met Gothic forces. The Romans deployed under a hot sun, expecting a quick rout of migrants turned rebels. Gothic cavalry returned to the field at a decisive moment, and the Roman line broke. An emperor died in battle. The loss reverberated through the officer corps, training regiments, and recruiting pools. Confidence faltered. The army did not disappear, but the aura of invincibility did. Generals learned that negotiations, subsidies, and settlement might achieve what decisive battles could not. From that point, Gothic leaders engaged Roman governors and emperors with leverage. They asked for grain allotments, recognized commands, and land to winter. Some bands raided when talks stalled, yet many sought formal status. Service under Roman eagles was not new. Gothic soldiers had already worn imperial gear, guarded distant forts, and even served in Egypt as part of rotating units long before they marched against Roman walls. Familiarity with pay tables, ranks, and supply routes made their demands precise. Alaric rose within this world of blended command. Trained in Roman campaigns and fluent in its procedures, he pushed for stable provisioning and a legal post that matched his responsibility. Court politics blocked him, so he used movement as pressure, leading his followers through the Balkans and into Italy. In 410, after failed negotiations and a siege economy that hurt Romans more than Goths, his forces entered Rome. The event shocked contemporaries because of the city's symbolic weight, yet the sack was short and controlled. Churches were spared. The message was clear: recognize authority, feed the army, and the damage stops. Afterward, Gothic groups took settlement deals across the western provinces. They farmed, collected taxes under supervision, and guarded frontiers. Roman law and Gothic custom met in councils and contracts. Every new agreement chipped away at the centralized control and replaced it with local bargains. The Western Empire still minted coins and issued orders, but power dispersed to commanders who held food, horses, and the loyalty of armed men. Out of that negotiated map, new kingdoms began to take shape. The next step moves inside those regimes, where law codes and churchmen turned fragile truces into rule. After the Western imperial title lost weight in 476, power settled where troops, taxes, and courts could still operate. Two Gothic paths took shape. In Italy, the Ostrogoths under Theodoric entered with a mandate to restore order while acknowledging the Eastern Emperor. In Hispania and parts of southern Gaul, the Visigoths consolidated settlement zones into a kingdom centered first at Toulouse and later Toledo. Both regimes built on Roman habits that still worked: Latin paperwork, land registers, and city councils that knew how to collect revenue. Theodoric made his court a hinge between Gothic arms and Roman administration. He kept the senatorial elite in place, respected property, and used established offices to run grain, roads, and justice. Soldiers answered to Gothic leaders, but tax clerks and judges largely stayed Roman. This dual arrangement limited friction. It also turned Ravenna, his capital, into a reliable meeting point for ambassadors and traders who needed predictable rules. Stability drew technical skill: mosaicists, metalworkers, scribes, because workshops flourish where contracts hold. For a generation, Ostrogothic Italy projected calm across a noisy continent. Repair crews maintained aqueducts, harbor authorities kept traffic moving, monasteries and urban churches received endowments. This bandwidth attracted scholars and administrators who could still find salaries and libraries. Letters from the court circulated formulas for petitions, edicts, and building requests, creating a portable kit of governance. The message was practical: keep Roman forms, translate them into current needs, and let the army guarantee the result. Across the Pyrenees, Visigothic rulers codified their mixed realm. They governed Roman provincials and Gothic elites under separate customs at first, then pushed toward a unified legal space. Building programs favored walled towns and episcopal centers, where bishops mediated disputes and organized relief. In architecture, you find sturdy basilicas and small rural churches tied to estates, with stone carving that blends local motifs and late antique themes. Royal authority moved with the court, but bishops and counts anchored daily order. Religion set the tone of politics. Visigothic kings began as patrons of Arian clergy, which helped mark Gothic identity, yet it complicated relations with Nicene majorities in towns. Over decades, policy shifted. Conversions at the top recalibrated alliances with urban bishops, who brought networks of schools, charitable funds, and legitimacy. Once kings aligned with Catholic practice, councils met regularly to regulate doctrine, property, and the behavior of officials. These sessions wrote canons that read like governance manuals, linking the altar to the archive. The Italian experiment met forces it could not absorb. Court rivalries and suspicions between military and senatorial circles opened space for intervention from Constantinople. Justinian's armies crossed into Italy, and years of war followed. Campaigns depopulated regions, damaged estates, and shredded the administrative continuity that had made Ravenna attractive. The Ostrogothic command structure fractured, and the system collapsed under the weight of sieges and attrition. The Visigothic kingdom endured longer, but its cohesion depended on balancing factions among nobles, church leaders, and the army. When external pressure arrived from North Africa and then across the strait, defenses faltered. Rapid advances after 711 ended royal control over most cities. Nobles negotiated survival locally while the center dissolved. One detail about Visigothic politics surprises modern audiences. Kingship there often required an election by leading nobles and clergy. That elective principle created rules for succession, but it also invited factions to organize, bargain, and sometimes revolt, shaping a political culture that prized councils as much as coronations. After the Gothic kingdoms rose and fell, a new family of rulers in the north set out to repair the machinery of government. The Carolingians built power through alliance with bishops, victories over rivals, and careful stewardship of land and tribute. They aimed to stabilize courts and counties, standardize law, and make rulership legible again. To do that, they needed trained readers, reliable scribes, and schools that could produce them. Instead of relying on scattered local habits, they pursued a continent-wide reset of learning and administration. Charlemagne gathered a circle of scholars from different regions and traditions. He installed them in palaces and major monasteries, then tasked them with correcting texts, teaching grammar, and setting shared expectations for how officials read and wrote. Alcuin of York became a key organizer. He streamlined curricula around basic tools: the Psalms for memory, grammar for clarity, and arithmetic for practical use in accounts and calendars. Other advisors introduced canonical collections and homily books, so priests across distant parishes preached from reliable texts, and officials quoted the same legal passages. Monasteries became production centers for this project. Scriptoria copied classical authors, biblical commentaries, and technical handbooks that risked vanishing through neglect. A copying order might specify the exact exemplar, the materials, and even the layout, because accuracy mattered for both worship and law. Monks also organized local libraries, cataloging holdings so books could circulate across networks. When a volume moved from one house to another, the receiving scribe annotated where it came from and whether corrections were made, creating a paper trail for knowledge. A key tool made these efforts scale: a cleaned-up handwriting system, now called Carolingian minuscule. Its rounded forms, clear word separation, and consistent punctuation allowed faster copying and easier reading. Students trained on this script could parse complex sentences and avoid clerical errors in charters, tax tallies, and capitularies. Over time, this script spread with royal letters and monastic exchanges, turning diverse regional hands into an intelligible standard. Art and architecture joined the program. Workshops produced gospel books with balanced page designs, interlace refined into measured patterns, and metalwork that framed relics and liturgical books. These objects trained the eye toward proportion and repeatable motifs. In building, Courts and bishops sponsored compact, geometrically ordered chapels that reused Roman elements while practicing precise measurement. The point was not size, but disciplined form, a habit of modules and ratios that planners could pass from site to site. This culture of order and verification laid groundwork for later innovation. When schools taught chant from uniform books, choirs moved in step and processions required predictable space. When charters followed shared templates, builders could read land rights and funding terms without confusion. When geometry returned to lesson plans, surveyors and masons spoke a common language of spans, bays, and centers. The revival did not produce Gothic structures, but it supplied the literate workforce, the administrative routines, and the visual training that later allowed large projects to proceed. After a century of fragmentation, fields stabilized, toll roads reopened, and rulers could plan beyond harvest to harvest. That calmer backdrop unlocked a wave of church construction between 900 and 1050. Counties and abbeys gathered surplus, hired crews, and set timetables that stretched across decades. Stone replaced timber in more places, not for show, but for durability and fire safety. Builders reused materials from older sites, yet new quarries opened near projects to keep supply steady. With predictable taxation and monastic estates maturing, patrons could order ambitious plans and expect them to reach completion. Architects reached back to reliable Roman habits and adjusted them to current needs. The rounded arch returned as the default span for doors, windows, and arcades. Thick masonry walls and barrel vaults took the load, turning smoke-prone wooden roofs into stone shells that resisted weather and flame. Masons laid courses with careful bonding and used lime mortars that cured into dense joints. Where spans widened, they turned to groin vaults, which crossed two barrels at right angles and sent weight down to corners. These choices favored stability over height, yet they taught crews how to handle thrust, settlement, and long-term maintenance. Monasteries grew into vast landholding complexes, commanding mills, vineyards, and workshops. Their churches advertised reliability. Massive naves, flanking aisles, and westward towers announced authority from a distance. Inside, strict layouts organized choir, altars, and relic niches so liturgy could run on time. Guest houses received travelers, infirmaries cared for the sick, scriptoria managed orders for books and charters. Romanesque forms fit this administrative rhythm. A regular bay system made expansion practical. Add a bay, extend the roof, and keep the plan legible to monks and visitors. Pilgrimage routes tied regions together, and towns on those paths scaled up to host influxes. Builders added ambulatories that circled the main altar, with radiating chapels to display relics without blocking processions. Broad transepts acted as pressure valves for crowds and offered side entries for guilds and confraternities. Stone pavements resisted wear from thousands of feet. Market days clustered around feast schedules, and local councils coordinated stalls, lodging, and security with the church calendar. These logistics shaped floor plans as much as theology did. Sculpture returned to church fronts and portals in force. Carvers set narrative reliefs into tympana and capitals, using clear storytelling to teach key episodes and moral lessons to audiences who could not read. On the inside, carved imposts and column heads linked liturgy to memory, a prophet, a parable, a sin to avoid, a virtue to cultivate. The discipline of repeating motifs across a nave trained workshops to standardize templates, a habit that later benefited tracery and moldings. Engineers learned by iteration. To stop vaults from spreading walls, they thickened the outer shells, adding string courses to define levels, and pilastered the exterior with engaged columns and buttress strips. Inside, compound piers gathered the loads from arches and vaults into concentrated paths toward foundations. Where soils shifted, builders experimented with deeper footings and wider plinths. Each adjustment refined a practical understanding of force and counterforce. Curved apses and continuous barrel vaults focused chant, carrying voices through the nave so monks sounded otherworldly to arriving pilgrims. That acoustical aim sat alongside security, crowd flow, and ritual needs, a full design brief that prepared minds and methods for the later pursuit of greater light. By the mid-11th century, towns grew, trade revived, and bishops had access to cash, labor, and credit. Urban guilds supplied tools and skills, markets moved more goods, and coinage circulated more reliably. With that base, cathedral projects shifted from repairs to complete rebuilds. City elites saw value in a vast nave that could host civic rites and draw pilgrims. Bishops understood that a monumental church signaled authority to rivals and patrons alike. The result was a race to plan on a scale hard to attempt a century earlier. Cathedral chapters, bodies of canons with budgets, land, and legal rights, turned into major civic players. They leased property, ran courts over their tenants, and negotiated with merchants for supply lines. Chapters compared accounts with neighbors and watched each other's elevations rise. Local pride pushed height and length as measures of success. Town councils joined in, tying fairs and toll exemptions to feast days and building milestones. That alignment of interests kept funding steady, even when crops failed or a bishop died. Materials came in volumes that demanded new logistics. Quarries expanded with stepped faces and ramps for carts. Stonecutters rough-shaped blocks near the source to reduce weight. Then riverboats and sledges moved loads to city walls. On site, hoists and treadwheel cranes lifted ashlar to staging platforms where teams dressed joints to tight tolerances. Regular deliveries allowed masons to standardize courses and keep walls rising week after week. The predictability of supply made ambitious vaulting schedules possible. Master masons organized labor like a standing company. Crews rotated between quarry, yard, and scaffold, while apprentices learned on tracing floors marked with full-scale profiles of arches and moldings. Contracts defined outputs by the bay, not just by the season. Carpenters set up centering for vaults. Smiths forged clamps and tools. Glaziers prepared panels in workshops that doubled as classrooms. The site functioned year-round, with winter tasks focusing on carving and iron, and summer favoring lifts and vault closures. Early cathedrals from this wave stretched naves and stressed vertical lines. Piers thickened to carry continuous arcades, galleries, and clerestories. Long processional routes demanded clear sightlines, so planners kept supports regular and spacing consistent. Transepts broke the mass and offered additional altars, while western towers acted as beacons over markets and river crossings. The aim was a foretaste of heaven through ordered space, a measured climb of columns, arches, and light tiers drawing the gaze upward. Inside, ritual expanded. Liturgical dramas needed platforms, aisles needed width for movement, and relic displays required controlled circulation. Ambulatories let pilgrims move behind the high altar without interrupting chant. Side chapels provided private masses and guild devotions during major feasts. Choir screens organized clergy and laity while preserving room for processions. Every addition tightened the coordination between architecture and ceremony, turning the cathedral into a managed theater of belief. Extracting stone for these projects erased entire slopes. Hillsides near some building sites lost their faces to stepped cuts, and local roads shifted to accommodate the quarries. Over decades, landscapes changed to feed the work. That physical imprint matched the social one: a durable workforce, a funding machine, and a schedule that outlived patrons, setting the stage for the next round of structural experiments aimed at greater light and finer control of thrust. The new look began quietly in the Ile-de-France, where workshops tied to royal abbeys and episcopal towns started trimming weight from stone. Builders were not chasing novelty for its own sake. They were trying to solve problems they knew well from earlier decades: how to span wide spaces without crushing the supports, how to open more wall surface to light, and how to guide large processions without forest-like piers blocking the route. The answer arrived as a set of structural ideas that departed from heavy Romanesque habits and gave designers more control over forces and space. Ribbed vaults made the ceiling a framework rather than a solid shell. Masons raised stone ribs first, found the correct curves using cords and templates, and then filled the panels between with lighter webbing. Loads gathered along the ribs and traveled down into clustered supports. With the thrusts mapped, they could reduce the bulk of the walls. Pointed arches added another level of flexibility. Because their geometry could vary, they balanced unequal spans and adjusted heights bay by bay without losing stability. That meant aisles and nave could align cleanly, and builders could keep a steady rhythm down the length of a church. Early flying buttresses completed the set. Instead of asking the wall to absorb thrust, builders sent it outward across open air to an exterior pier. Once the connection carried the force, the wall no longer had to act like a dam. Openings could grow and surfaces could thin. Even small, cautious versions of this idea had a major effect on interiors. Clerestories expanded, and galleries could lighten without fear of spreading. These methods needed patrons ready to accept risk. Powerful abbots and bishops in the region provided that cover. They managed land, labor, and income, and they wanted buildings that reflected corporate confidence. Churches turned into laboratories. Crews tested different rib patterns, varied arch heights, and tried new pier profiles that bundled shaft after shaft into clean lines. When a combination worked, it spread through letters, visits, and the movement of foremen from one site to the next. Stained glass workshops advanced in lockstep. Larger window fields required strong armatures and precise leadwork. Glassmakers refined color, learned to cast panes with fewer flaws, and cut pieces to fit complex tracery. Glaziers organized stories across tall lights, stacking episodes in a way that matched the new vertical scale. Light entered not as scattered points, but as clear planes that marked out the bays and emphasized the order of the structure. The renovation of key churches made the change visible to a wide audience. At Saint-Denis, work on the choir and surrounding chapels demonstrated how ribs, pointed arches, and exterior support could turn walls into a continuous ring of light. Pilgrims walked through a space where columns gathered, Arches rose, and colored windows filled the background. The effect was not only visual. Processions moved more easily around the shrine, and clergy could manage traffic without losing the flow of the liturgy. This shift tracked with a broader turn toward symbolism and illumination. Planners treated light as a sign that the space itself could point upward. The discipline of geometry, the ordering of stories in glass, and the careful control of structure all aimed at clarity. Some early Gothic sites preserved geometry sketches scratched into unfinished stones, arcs, triangles, and layout marks left in place, blueprints made on the wall itself as crews rehearsed the forms that would soon define a new style. The fire of 1194 cleared the decks at Chartres and forced a decision: rebuild along old lines or accept a full redesign using the newest structural grammar. The chapter chose speed and coherence. Within days, masons set out a plan that locked nave, transept, and choir into a single continuous system. Foundations widened to receive greater loads, piers were plotted at regular intervals, and the design fixed the relationship between ground level, gallery, and clerestory from the start. This meant fewer ad hoc fixes and a cleaner result as the walls rose. Master builders reached for vaults that carried weight with a leaner profile. Quadripartite rib vaults ran bay to bay with a steady rhythm, tying the side aisles to the central vessel. The ribs took the thrust and handed it to bundled shafts, which read as uninterrupted lines from floor to springing to keystone. Flying buttresses outside caught the push and sent it down into piers with set-offs that marked stages of force. The effect inside was a calm, vertical sweep. Nothing blocked the eye as it climbed through arcade, gallery, and window tier. That unity made the space feel legible, even at an enormous scale. Glass turned that structure into a teaching tool. Chartres amassed one of the largest cycles of stained glass windows in medieval Europe, arranged by theme and patron. Bay after bay stacked scenes from scripture, saints' lives, virtues, trades, and civic emblems. Door panels placed local guilds into the sacred story, linking work to worship. Lead cames traced firm outlines so figures stayed clear at a distance, while borders standardized motifs across many lights. As sunlight moved, the sequence read like a slow scroll, giving processions cues and anchoring sermons to visible references throughout the nave. Scripture at the royal portals provided the threshold curriculum. The jam figures stretched tall and calm, their drapery cut into controlled folds that echoed the column below. Faces turned slightly, eyes attentive, as if hearing instruction. Archivolt bands carry prophets and elders in ordered ranks, while capitals beneath narrate episodes that prepare the visitor for the themes inside. The program balanced elegance with precision. You can walk from scene to scene and trace doctrine without a guide, because the arrangement follows a consistent logic tied to liturgy. What worked at Chartres did not stay put. The clarity of elevation, the measured vaulting, and the disciplined buttressing offered a kit that other workshops could adapt. At Rheims, teams refined the sculptural formula and opened facades further. At Amiens, the bay modules stretched taller while keeping the same structural chain. Itinerant masters, foremen, and glaziers carried tracery sketches, profile templates, and icon lists along roads that linked royal, episcopal, and market centers. A mason trained in one yard could step into another and understand the grammar without a long briefing. knowledge moved in practical ways. Tracing floors kept full-scale patterns for arches and ribs. Wax tablets held quick calculations. Shop books logged moldings and glass receipts. Crews compared notes when fairs brought them together, and patrons hired talent across regions to keep schedules. This circulation built a shared language that still allowed local accent. The famed Chartres blue came from recipes medieval glassmakers could produce but never match exactly later. Even with modern tools, researchers struggled for decades to replicate that depth and stability in large panes. The pigment and furnace practice formed a sweet spot that the 13th century hit consistently. French workshops set the pace, and rulers elsewhere took notice. Royal courts, bishops, and merchant councils sent envoys to study the new grammar of ribs, pointed arches, and flying buttresses. They returned with sketch rolls, mold profiles, and notes on budgets and staffing. Adopting Gothic offered more than style. It promised efficient spans, brighter interiors for complex liturgies, and a public signal that a city could marshal resources across decades. As plans crossed borders, each region filtered the method through climate, materials, and long-standing building habits. England shaped the system around length and measured horizontals. Long naves cut across monastic precincts and cathedral closes, serving processions that stretched by rank and rule. Designers favored string courses and layered wall planes that read like steps across the elevation. Moldings broke into crisp bands, and shafts ran in disciplined lines, yet the push was lateral rather than purely vertical. Vaults often kept a steady, level springing to unify wide interiors under a single canopy. Decorative patterns treated surfaces like fields for controlled repetition, with foliage and geometric carving calibrated to the viewer's slow walk under arcades. In German lands, builders leaned toward monumental fronts and soaring markers over river towns and trade routes. West facades thickened into deep screens with multiple portal stages, and towers reached for visibility across flat plains. Spires rose from firm masonry stages into lighter frames, giving distant cues to travelers and merchants. Inside, tall arcades and pronounced clerestories made the nave feel like a shaft of light. The preference for vertical emphasis matched civic and princely rivalries, where height and silhouette counted as durable statements of rank. Across the Pyrenees, Gothic engineering met Islamic craft traditions. Workshops in Spain set pointed systems over floors patterned with intricate stone inlay and plaster carving. Screens and portals took on layered profiles with interlaced motifs, while windows framed colored glass with tracery that echoed earlier stucco and woodwork. Builders arranged chapels along ambulatories for relic veneration, yet they wrapped arches and vaults in ornament that read at close range, turning passageways into galleries of line and light. The structural kit held, but the surface language shifted toward rich texture and rhythmic detail. Italian cities accepted elements selectively. Stone vaults covered choirs and crossings, while broad naves sometimes kept timber roofs for speed and climate. Pointed arches organized arcades, and rose windows brightened facades facing busy piazzas. Builders mixed marble bands, classical profiles, and carved portals that spoke to local civic pride and Roman memory. The result balanced clarity of span with the public front of a city hall. A church that fit urban rhythms of fairs, councils, and processions while nodding to older masonry and proportion rules still taught on tracing floors. As this spread continued, A shared architectural language took hold. Pilgrims could read the sequence of bays, clergy could stage ritual with predictable routes, and guilds could sponsor windows that fit known formats. Even as borders shifted and lords changed, workshops recognized one another's templates, tool marks, and scheduling norms. That common ground fostered cooperation across dioceses and ports, giving Christian Europe a practical unity in stone. By the mid-13th century, workshops treated structure like a calibrated instrument. The goal was clear: raise vaults higher while thinning supports and widening openings. Crews refined every step: survey, tracing, lifting, and closure, so the geometry stayed tight even as spans grew. Towns competed, patrons funded long schedules, and trained chapters kept records that allowed a project to run for decades with consistent aims. The result was a sustained push toward vertical clarity that set the era apart from earlier experiments. Flying buttresses became precise tools rather than heavy props. Masons trimmed the arches into slender profiles, adjusted their springing points to meet the thrust line, and stacked small pinnacles over the outer piers to add counterweight without mass. Set-offs along the buttress told you where forces changed direction. Carvers shaped drip molds to shed water, preserving joints, and iron cramps tied stone elements so movement under wind loads stayed within tolerances. These refinements let builders open the wall between supports while keeping the vault stable. With the thrust carried outside, windows expanded until masonry read as a web that framed light. Clerestories merged with traceried networks, and the glass fields grew into unified planes across multiple bays. Glaziers coordinated figure scale and border patterns, so stories remained legible far from the floor. Lead lines reinforced the drawing, while distributing loads across the panels. Inside, the effect was practical as well as striking. Daylight evened across the nave, processions could follow visual cues, and clergy could anchor sermons to scenes that repeated at regular intervals. Vaulting reached new complexity. Masons introduced tiercerons and liernes, supplementary ribs that created intricate webs while directing weight back to key points. Keystone bosses grew larger to lock more ribs at convergence, and temporary centering evolved into modular frames that crews could reuse bay after bay. Piers thinned into clusters of shafts, each one assigned a clear task in the load path. Joints were cut to high accuracy, and lime mortars cured under managed humidity so closures happened cleanly without twist. Some sites pressed ambition to the limit. At Beauvais, the choir rose higher than any Gothic vault before or since. The plan sought unmatched elevation and a glass-dominated shell supported by an external skeleton. The height magnified every variable: wind, settlement, thermal shift. Parts failed, and sections collapsed during construction in later decades. The community rebuilt with heavier bracing and altered spans, yet the dream of a fully realized scheme never returned. The church stands with a vast choir and a truncated body, proof of the edge on which high Gothic builders worked. The sensory goal guided all this effort. Designers aimed for interiors that felt ordered by light and ratio. Vertical lines pulled the gaze upward through arcade, gallery, and clerestory, while color-washed daylight softened the stone and marked liturgical time. References to the heavenly city moved from metaphor into measurable choices. Bay modules set to repeating numbers, windows stacked in steady ranks, and pavements gridded to steer movement. Beauvais' choir soared so high that its vault surpassed every peer, only to fail under its own ambition. Repairs stabilized parts, but the plan remained unfinished, an enduring lesson on balance between calculation and risk. The next step follows how master networks extended this precision while putting meaning on the threshold and in the glass. By the later 13th century, stone figures stepped away from the column and began to act. Earlier jam statues held the pose of the peer. Now, bodies flexed at the hips, knees unlocked, and hands engaged with scrolls, books, or the edge of a mantle. Drapery no longer fell as parallel grooves, but broke around the waist, gathered at elbows, and hinted at the weight and movement underneath. Smiles appeared, not broad, but enough to suggest attention or welcome. As workshops trained on lifelike proportion, saints became recognizable types, youthful martyrs with short hair, bearded apostles with firm gaze, and bishops traced by the crozier line curling beside the face. Facades turned into readable manuals. Portals stacked themes in layers. Tympana framed core mysteries. Archivolts set ranked witnesses. Lintels narrated transitions. And jam figures presented living intercessors at human height. You could scan across a west front and trace the year in stone. Labors of the months, signs of the zodiac, feasts, virtues confronting vices. Cloister walks extended the sequence with capitals that ran small dramas at eye level. Jonah twisting in the fish, Daniel steady among the lions, the prodigal slumped in sudden recognition. A visitor did not need a book. The structure gave the lesson by route and order. Sculptors guided reactions using the body as grammar. A lifted finger directed attention up the arch. A turned torso invited entry. A lowered eyelid softened judgment scenes at thresholds. Carvers sharpened cheekbones with shallow planes so features read from the ground. Pupils drilled into round hollows caught light and gave eyes a focus point. Hair and beard patterns shifted by rank, allowing quick identification from below. Even the scale of hands mattered. Enlarged palms cued blessing or warning in crowded compositions. Programs did not grow by accident. Cathedral chapters and canons drafted themes, aligned them with liturgical stations, and set priorities for donors. A portal facing the market favored parables on money, charity, and fair measure. A side porch used by guilds highlighted patron saints of crafts. A bishop's door gathered prophets and teachers linked to sermons delivered inside. Supervising clergy checked inscriptions and attributes so that no figure strayed from accepted doctrine. Workshops kept sequences consistent across years as bays rose, ensuring that a delayed facade still matched the theological map set at the start. Gargoyles and grotesques played a double role. Water ran through their backs and blasted from mouths, protecting ashlar and mortar below. At the same time, they staged fear, mockery, and warning on safe edges of the sacred. Hybrids crouched with exaggerated jaws or hunched shoulders, casting a glance back toward town roofs as if to mirror gossip, pride, or gluttony. Some perched near dormers or gallery walks where clergy would see them daily, a steady nudge about vigilance and folly. Stone and structure fused. Colonnettes dissolved into figure shafts. Canopies above heads turned into miniature facades. Porch vaults grew ribs that met over kings and saints, tying narrative to geometry. In cloisters, arcades framed story panels so the walk itself read like a processional book. Many grotesques took their cues from local faces. Carvers slipped in a baker's scowl, a notary's sharp nose, or a familiar hood, setting townspeople aloft as creatures of stone that still shed rain on market days. Universities took shape out of cathedral schools that already trained clergy to read, preach, and keep records. Around 1200, groups of masters and students formalized these schools into guilds with charters, statutes, and legal privileges. They organized faculties for theology, law, medicine, and the arts, and agreed on fees, lecture times, and exam procedures. Towns supported them because thousands of visitors needed lodging, books, and food, and because courts and councils wanted graduates who could draft statutes and argue cases. Degrees certified competence. A bachelor proved readiness to teach basics. A master or doctor signaled authority to lecture and judge disputes within the faculty. Teaching turned methodical. The day began with a lecture on an approved text. A master read a passage, explained terms, mapped arguments, and resolved contradictory glosses. Students copied notes on wax tablets or in cheap paper booklets. Later, a disputation put the method under pressure. One side posed a question. Opponents listed objections. The presiding master sorted the evidence and delivered a determination. This routine trained clear definition, clean divisions, and careful use of authorities. It also produced a shared habit of analysis that trained preachers, lawyers, physicians, and administrators in the same mental moves. Scholastic thinkers pushed the method toward synthesis. They treated faith and reason as partners with distinct tools. Revelation supplied first principles. Logic tested coherence and clarified terms. A standard format emerged. State the question, list objectives, present a counterstatement, then resolve the objections one by one. Theology borrowed techniques from dialectic, while law, medicine, and the arts borrowed structure from theology. Over time, this grid shaped how sermons were outlined, how legal briefs were assembled, and how medical case notes were written. Manuscript production kept pace. University stationers held exemplars of required books, hired teams of copyists, and rented out sections in parts so students could afford access. Correctors checked errors against the master copy. Artists added simple initials for the basics and more elaborate diagrams for law, medicine, and astronomy. Encyclopedias compiled summaries of available knowledge. Translations of ancient works entered the syllabus in steady waves, and commentaries multiplied as each faculty built its own strand of interpretation. The result was a circulating library that reached from one city to another through alumni, merchants, and mendicant orders. Universities did not stand apart from city life. Students filled inns, joined confraternities, and debated in rental halls. Processions marked feast days and academic milestones, and town officials negotiated privileges during tensions or strikes. Cathedral chapters supplied stipends, choirs, and chapels for ceremonies. In return, cities gained notaries, physicians, and teachers who could serve hospitals, guilds, and courts. The classroom and the street learned from each other. Market regulations, tax rules, and hospital statutes reflected academic habits of orderly definition and proof. The intellectual climate supported advances that outlived the century. Optics clarified how light travels and how lenses bend rays. Mathematics standardized calculation for accounts, calendars, and surveying. Natural philosophy refined motion, force, and time. Here's a fun fact. Medieval masters often used thought experiments to test claims, and one analysis described motion in a way that anticipates inertia long before formal mechanics. These tools fed back into architecture, mapping, and administration, giving builders, surveyors, and clerks a stronger kit as new projects and crises arrived. While stone rose higher, stories stretched across halls and hearths. Courts hosted readings where knights and ladies weighed loyalty, tested wit, and mapped the rules of honor. Writers drew on old heroic stock but recast it for a world of tournaments, councils, and carefully staged manners. The result was a culture that trained memory and behavior through verse and tale, with expectations as strict as any coat of arms. Listeners learned when to speak, when to wait, and what a promise cost. Troubadours in the south and trouvères in the north composed songs that balanced desire with restraint. They used fixed stanza forms, repeating melodies, and layered metaphors to show how longing shaped conduct. A knight's worth came as much from measured language as from combat skill. Performers traveled between castles with small teams, sharing tunes that local musicians could adopt and vary. Patrons rewarded precision, clean rhyme, steady rhythm, and a moral point that fit the audience's rank and season. Epic cycles and romance collections set the stage for ideals of knighthood. Tales of quests, feasts, and vows taught listeners how courage meets counsel and how strength submits to rule. Characters confronted choices between loyalty to a lord, duty to kin, and personal oath. The stories did not erase conflict, they managed it. Courtly settings offered judgment scenes where words, gifts, and ritual acts repaired damage. Young nobles practiced these scripts as part of their education, learning how a hall could claim rivalries without blood. As audiences widened, writers turned more often to the languages people spoke at home. French, German, Italian, and other tongues gained book status. Scribes copied vernacular texts alongside Latin service books, and readers recognized their own speech in the lines. That shift gave local law and custom a stronger voice, because prose and verse could cite sayings and place names directly. It also made performance more flexible. A reader could switch between prayer, charter, and romance without changing language. Books became objects that staged stories as much as they recorded them. Illuminated manuscripts framed scenes with colored borders and highlighted names with gold. Margins filled with small episodes that echoed or teased the main plot. Knights bent over maps, queens exchanged rings, and messengers carried sealed letters whose red wax flashed against blue ground. Artists coordinated palette across gatherings, so a reader paging through weeks later still felt the thread. Workshop notes marked where an image should fall, tying text breaks to visual beats. Women shaped the field as patrons, performers, and writers. Noblewomen commissioned collections, hosted readings, and set themes that suited their courts. Some authored narratives that tracked how reputation moves through rumor and how silence or speech can save a household. Their influence showed in the focus of counsel, delay, and the cost of anger. Rooms arranged for listening, benches, carpets, a chair by the fire, became places where policy and poetry met. Scribes sometimes slipped playful doodles into margins to keep long days bearable, armored men dueling giant snails or rabbits turning the hunt around. Those jokes sit beside careful script and careful paint, a reminder that even in halls of rule and devotion, wit found space. The next wave will test this culture's balance as disease, doubt, and new tastes complicate patronage and narrow the stage. The plague rode the same arteries that carried grain, wool, and letters. It moved from ports into market towns, then along river valleys and cart roads into the countryside. Merchants, sailors, and carters unknowingly ferried infected fleas, and the disease advanced in waves. Ports locked gates and posted watches, but the pathogen outran orders. In some regions, mortality spiked within weeks of the first cases. In others, it persisted through cycles that hit again as the seasons turned. Isolated hamlets failed to escape. The trade network that had enriched cities now delivered catastrophe to their doors. As deaths rose, labor and supply collapsed together. Mills went silent when no one came to haul grain. Fields lay unharvested because households had no hands left to cut. Guild workshops missed deadlines, and building sites stopped when teams thinned below safe numbers. Parish lists lost names faster than clerks could revise them. Toll booths collected little because traffic dwindled. Survivors inherited tools and land, but lacked partners to run them. Wills accumulated on notaries' tables. In some districts, whole streets emptied and tax rolls had to be rewritten from scratch. Traditional responses failed to halt the spread. Processions, fasts, and public prayers assembled crowds and sometimes made conditions worse. Clergy worked burial grounds and last rites until exhaustion set in. Many died, and parishes went untended. Confidence in local pastors faltered when remedies stayed the same and results did not improve. Town councils tried quarantine, fumigation, and cordons, yet enforcement varied and exceptions multiplied. People watched the most familiar rituals continue without effect and asked if the authorities had lost their grip. Reactions split. Some leaned into extreme piety. Flagellants staged marches, households vowed pilgrimages, and benefactors gave property to hospitals and poor relief. Others drifted toward despair or violence. Rumors blamed strangers, travelers, or minority communities and sparked attacks that further destabilized trade and trust. Towns that kept order did so with armed watches and strict penalties on unlicensed gatherings. Families closed doors, tended to their own, and left markets to those with risk and bravery enough to sell. Artists began to mark the new mood. Murals and manuscript initials gave death a central role, and themes of the danse macabre set peasants, nobles, and clergy in one chain, equal under the scythe. Funerary sculpture simplified, with less emphasis on lifelike portraiture and more on the plain form of the deceased. Wall paintings added hourglasses, wilting flowers, and skeletal guides who addressed viewers across the nave. These images worked as reminders and warnings, fitting in a world in which tomorrow looked uncertain. The economy did not return to its old shape. With fewer workers, wages rose where bargaining could occur. Landlords offered better terms to keep tenants. Some peasants moved to towns that needed hands. Serfdom weakened in many regions as obligations were commuted into rent. Workshops adjusted by training faster, promoting earlier, and adopting tools that saved time. Town councils gained leverage because markets revived sooner than great estates, and civic administrations learned to coordinate grain stores, hospital beds, and burial crews with clear authority. Some chroniclers describe ships drifting into harbor with every crew member dead, ghost vessels that carried rats and infected fleas to the next coastline. The shock forced communities to update records, rewrite contracts, and rethink how to organize care and worship under strain. Court workshops shifted tone after the crisis years. Princes and duchesses wanted images that projected calm order, polished manners, and the visual glamour of wealth. Artists answered with a style that favored long, tapering figures, controlled gestures, and surfaces loaded with fine pattern. Drapery fell in smooth cascades that skimmed the body rather than gripping it. Hair, fur, brocade, and tooled leather received patient attention, line by line. Gold grounds and pale skies kept focus on faces and hands, where small movements carried meaning. Painters and illuminators tuned their craft for elegance and legibility. Faces tilted in quiet conversation, wrists turned with measured grace, eyes followed the flow of a scroll or the curve of a scepter. Color palettes balanced soft pinks, cool blues, and clear greens against flashes of metal leaf. Borders became stages of their own, ivy sprays, quatrefoils, and tiny beasts organized into repeatable chains. In panel painting, halos thinned and tilted, allowing heads to sit in space rather than against a flat disc. In books, line drawing did more work, with ultrafine brushstrokes defining noses, lips, and eyelids before color washes sealed the forms. Patronage set the pace and the route. Courts in France and Burgundy hired teams that traveled with retinues. English and imperial households commissioned matching sets of books, panels, and textiles so distant residencies spoke the same visual language. Workshops swapped assistants during large orders to keep schedules, and messenger routes carried sample leaves, panel cartoons, and pigment lists. The result was a steady flow of motifs: tall saints who move as if in a procession, angels with swept-back wings, and courtiers dressed in the latest cut. Manuscript illumination became a laboratory for technical finesse. Stationers prepared vellum scraped to uniform thinness, scribes left planned blanks, and painters built scenes from underdrawing to highlight with almost invisible hairs at the brush tip. Flesh tones layered white over pink and green to find translucence. Armor caught light with tiny diagonal hatches. Margins hosted birds, flowers, and heraldry painted small but crisp. Craftsmen tracked their materials with care, sizing, gilding, and burnishing in stages so gold sat mirror smooth beside matte pigments. Across regions, local habits blended into a courtly standard. French line and pattern met Flemish attentiveness to surface. English taste for narrative clarity joined German preference for emphatic outline. Northern Italian love of marble settings and classical trim entered through frames, thrones, and arcades. The mix produced a style that read quickly as aristocratic, no matter the city. A viewer could walk from Paris to Prague and recognize kinship in the slope of a shoulder, the fall of a sleeve, the way a page border turns a corner. Artists also probed depth and observation. Interiors gained tiled floors drawn to a point. City views stacked roofs and towers into believable distance. Gardens set plants by type rather than generic leaf masses. Hands rested on furniture with weight. Fabrics folded around knees in ways that hinted at the body beneath. These tests of space and form prepared audiences for later work that pushed perspective and anatomy even further. The 14th century ended with crises, but the cranes did not come down. City workshops kept their schedules, and councils approved new contracts even as wars and bad harvests strained treasuries. Builders shifted crews from halted town walls to church sites, and the sound of chisels continued. When wages rose because fewer workers were available, masters changed how they planned. They standardized stone sizes, reused timber scaffolds, and stretched timelines across generations, turning a single project into a civic habit that could survive short shocks. Architects leaned into spectacle. Vault webs grew denser, not heavier, as ribs split into fans, nets, and stars that seemed to float. Tracery in windows and screens broke into ever finer strands, knitting stone like lace while keeping loads under control. Spires lengthened with lightweight shells, ringed by open work that cut wind pressure. Parapets evolved into ornate cresting, and pinnacles multiplied because they worked as counterweights as much as ornaments. The goal was clear: surpass the known record without losing the structure. Milan Cathedral became the giant of the period. It turned to a pale marble that could be quarried in big blocks yet carved thin, and its plan spread into a forest of clustered piers that carry a roof so broad that crews treated it as a workyard between phases. Its design team drew on northern methods and Italian stonecraft, testing iron ties to tame thrust across a vast region. The building's silhouette rose as a thicket of spires, with openwork tracery that chased light rather than mass. The result was a late Gothic ambition scaled to a metropolis. Across the Alps in England, masons organized gravity differently. At Gloucester, fan vaults grew from a single geometric rule: equal radius cones that meet in smooth webs. The effect looks effortless, but it came from strict setting out with compass and template, then careful thinning where stress allowed. Those fans spread across cloisters and choirs, creating ceilings that read as continuous surfaces rather than intersecting arches. They solved weight by distributing it evenly, then hiding the math under calm patterns. Regional paths pulled apart. German workshops emphasized huge west fronts and needle spires, turning facades into towers of tracery that telegraphed city pride from far off. Spain fused structural daring with dense surface ornament. In Castile and Aragon, late vaults braided into star patterns, while screens and portals gathered Moorish-inflected carving. Italian sites kept wide naves and strong wall planes, opting for colored stone and sculpted profiles, while borrowing northern buttressing only where needed. England refined linear patterns and paneling, extending vertical lines across walls so that ceilings, windows, and screens read as one system. Money came from many hands. Guilds pledged annual dues and processions that doubled as fundraising campaigns. City councils levied market fees and earmarked fines to keep stone yards supplied. Wealthy donors financed chapels in exchange for burial rites and memorial masses, which in turn created new alcoves and screens. Workshops adapted to labor shortages by training youths earlier and by importing skilled crews across borders, using shared yard marks and contracts that spelled out wages, board, and tool rights. Stonecraft kept evolving, but the preferred language of beauty began to shift. Patrons and scholars in mid-15th century Italy argued for a return to measured order, and their preferences filtered into workshops that had spent generations refining Gothic patterns. The old taste for branching ribs and intricate tracery met a new appetite for clarity. Proportions tied to simple ratios replaced layered vertical lines. Plans followed circles and squares laid out with compass and rule. Builders set out facades on grids, and ornament aligned to axes that presented a calm, legible face to the street. Humanist circles gave this shift its backbone. They copied ancient texts and compared ruins, noting how columns express both structure and a set of rules. They cared about symmetry because they saw it as a reflection of harmonies that governed music and number. Artists learned to stage space using linear perspective, which brought a mathematical logic to images and architectural schemes. When they mapped a floor as a coherent plane and let orthogonals recede to a vanishing point, walls, arches, and domes followed that same sense of order. The result felt new, even when the materials were familiar. Architects in the Italian states turned these ideas into built practice. Instead of clustered piers, they returned to freestanding columns and pilasters with capitals that matched revived orders. Round arches marched across arcades with consistent spans, and domes crowned crossings with clear structural intent. Builders used coffering to lighten vaults and entablatures to regulate horizontal lines. Courtyards became lessons in proportion, and chapels resolved themselves into balanced bays rather than elongated aisles. Slowly, commissions that once defaulted to pointed profiles began to specify round arches and classical moldings. The printing press sped up the conversion. Technical notes, model books, and design treatises could now circulate beyond one city. Students read the same diagrams, and patrons compared illustrations before they chose a plan. Workshops that had guarded patterns inside the yard found their methods standardized by printed pages. Education shifted from memory and oral instruction toward books used as reference tools. That change gave builders a shared vocabulary, and it gave clients the confidence to request a certain look and a measured set of dimensions. Gothic yards did not disappear. Many kept finishing naves, towers, and chapels based on earlier contracts, while also fabricating classical profiles for portals or tombs. Carvers who once set crockets on pinnacles learned egg and dart and acanthus leaves. Stone cutters adapted templates, swapping pointed moldings for rounded ones, but keeping efficient routines for quarrying, hoisting, and setting. Bronze foundries recast their skills in relief into doors with narrative panels framed by pilasters. Continuity in labor met change in taste. North of the Alps, the blend read differently. Ports and cities kept the vertical energy of late Gothic, but folded in Italian ratios and surface treatments. You see domes over hall churches, panels that echo pilaster spacing, and facades that align windows in measured grids while retaining tracery in the upper zones. Painters adopted perspective while keeping gilded backgrounds and patterned textiles. In woodwork, canopies still rise like pinnacles, yet their bases line up to classical modules. The result is a transitional language that carries both lineages at once. South of the Alps, patrons turned to domes and columns. North of them, cities kept hiring masons fluent in pointed arches and long roofs. Contracts for towers, chancels, and guild halls carried dates well into the 16th century, with town ledgers listing stone deliveries and scaffold repairs alongside market expenses. The style held because it fit local habits. Parish networks, processions, and civic ceremonies needed large halls and clear sightlines. Builders knew how to organize these sites, and councils saw no reason to change the system that kept people working and public life visible. England, Germany, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia advanced that continuity in bricks and stone. English workshops extended perpendicular lines across nave walls and window heads, turning interiors into steady grids that read cleanly from floor to vault. German towns backed small westworks and needle spires for parish churches and market-side chapels, using facades to announce civic weight to travelers on the road. In the Low Countries, brick, late Gothic framed town halls with deep porches and stepped gables, while riverside cities set new belfries to guard charters and bells. Scandinavia favored long timber roofs over stone arches, then tied them to pointed vaults with robust buttresses where funds allowed. Northern craft drew ornament into dense systems. Vaults multiplied ribs into nets and stars, tracing paths that spread loads while creating layered patterns. Tracery broke into slender bars and ogis that turned windows into woven screens. Porches grew as micro-architectures, with canopies, niches, and pinnacles staged to frame civic entries and side chapels. The effect did not copy earlier French models. It moved toward planar surfaces and repeatable modules, a late language that valued rhythm and craft control. Reformation currents passed through these same rooms. Councils issued orders to clear altars and images, to remove reliquaries, and to cover wall paintings. Yet they left walls and vaults standing. Choir screens came down in many places to open views toward the pulpit, and chantry chapels shifted to seating or storage. You can read the change in scars, locked image brackets, empty niche canopies, and patched floors where tomb slabs moved. The building remained the venue for worship and meetings, but its focus turned toward the word and the spoken lesson. Wood kept richness where images went quiet. Carpenters and carvers installed choir stalls with elbow rests, misericords, and tracery backs that fold complex geometry into hand-scaled details. Pulpits rose on posts with stair rails and sounding boards, their panels cut with canopies and foliage at a depth that catches sidelight. Altarpieces, where permitted, held crowded scenes in relief, with tiny architecture framing figures under miniature vaults. Joinery stayed tight because workshops used standardized mortises and templates that could be repeated bay after bay. Painting followed a related path. Northern tastes lean toward faces that show strain, hands that press and plead, and landscapes mapped with careful textures. That attention to narrative and feeling set a tone for artists who worked along the Danube and in reformed courts, even when subjects changed. Panels brought viewers close to scenes with clear props and measured interiors, and printmakers spread those images across borders at low cost. By the mid-18th century, a tidy, rational way of thinking guided taste. Architects, collectors, and critics praised clean lines, right angles, and clear rules. That same confidence in reason stirred a countercurrent. Some writers, painters, and patrons felt that neat systems left out awe, fear, and wonder. They turned backward to the Middle Ages for forms that signaled spiritual depth, irregular beauty, and a slower sense of time. The past became a resource, not for direct imitation at first, but for mood and moral weight. Romantic authors shaped the mood. They treated the medieval centuries as a realm where faith, landscape, and human feeling reached deeper notes than polite salons could manage. In their essays and stories, crumbling chapels and storm-worn castles stood for inner states. Harsh weather, dim light, and cavernous interiors gave voice to loss, loyalty, and longing. The word Gothic drifted away from a strict architectural label and toward an atmosphere, mystery, danger, and sincerity bound together. Readers responded because those scenes offered experiences that reasoned prose did not supply. Painters and poets reinforced the shift through ruins. Old abbeys and keeps, once dismissed as useless stone, gained new value as subjects that combined beauty with decay. Artists studied broken arches, ivy on walls, and exposed vault ribs, recording how time marked masonry. These images carried a calm sadness, but also relief. The ruin allowed viewers to step out of clock time and into a long view where human lives were brief and memory could still persist. Landscape became a stage, and medieval remains served as anchors for that stage. While artists built feeling, early antiquarians built method. They measured arches, counted moldings, and sketched floor plans bay by bay. They noted regional traits, dated carvings by costume, and compared tracery types across counties. Their notebooks sorted chaos into families of forms. That work fed a new idea. Medieval buildings were coherent systems worth preserving. Local societies began to advocate repairs that respected old fabric rather than replacing it wholesale, and pamphlets spread basic rules for careful maintenance. Popular reading took a darker route. Stories set in drafty corridors and sealed chambers turned architecture into a machine for suspense. Hidden staircases and locked doors formed the plot. The term Gothic now pointed to fear, secrecy, and the uncanny as much as to stone. The style re-entered common speech through these tales, which taught wide audiences how to read pointed arches as signals of mood. Stage sets and chapbooks then circulated those signals through fairs and cheap theaters. Money followed interest. Landowners added follies to parks, sham towers, mock priory fronts, and hermitages placed to catch a view. These projects hired masons to cut pointed openings, set tracery screens, and raise battlements that framed sunsets rather than defended anything. Wealthy collectors filled interiors with stained glass gathered from closed chapels, fitting medieval patterns into new sash windows. Garden designers aligned paths to deliver a timed reveal of a ruin at a turn, using architecture as a tool for pacing. By the 1830s, commissions across Britain began to specify pointed arches, ribbed vaulting queues, and vertical tracery for new churches and civic halls. Parishes ordered tall naves with clear glass to brighten interiors. Dioceses founded training schools and wanted them to look rooted and moral. Universities added quadrangles with gatehouses and buttressed chapels to advertise continuity with medieval training. Town councils used the style for libraries, museums, and law courts, turning municipal streets into galleries of stone where identity and duty read clearly from the facades. As the empire expanded, this language traveled. Colonial cathedrals, colleges, and government offices repeated the silhouettes with local materials and climates in mind. Advocates argued that form carried ethics. They praised visible structure, fair materials, and handicraft that left tool marks under the finish. They linked upright lines and honest joints to Christian discipline, and they warned that stage-set facades hid weak habits behind smooth plaster. Pattern books taught how to lay out moldings, traceries, and roofs using repeatable rules rather than arbitrary ornament. Builders learned that a window's mullion should align with an interior bay, that a buttress should read as the counter to a vault, and that decoration should grow from construction. The contest for a national seat of government turned theory into a model. After the old Houses of Parliament burned, a new plan called for a riverfront mass with towers, pinnacles, and long ranges of windows tied to a strict grid. The scheme used modern foundations and fireproof floors while presenting a unified Gothic outline that could be read from bridges and embankments. The clock tower, the central crossing tower, and the rhythmic facades signaled authority, yet the detailing aimed at moral clarity, ordered repetition, legible structure, and careful stone carving that spoke of craft over display. Industrial tools pushed the style further than medieval crews could have managed. Foundries rolled iron into slender beams and ribs. Glaziers set sheets of plate glass into traceries that looked delicate but spanned wider bays. Prefabrication cut costs. Terracotta and cast stone repeated capitals and bosses with tight consistency, while steam-powered saws and lathes produced woodwork in volume. Railway stations and market halls adopted Gothic outlines while hiding iron arches and trusses behind timber or stone screens. Churches used metal ties to control thrusts and stretch roof spans without heavy walls. The appeal spread overseas. City councils in France, Germany, and the Low Countries refitted old districts with town halls shaped by towers and arcades. In the United States and Canada, colleges planned campuses as sequences of quads with buttressed halls and oriel windows, arguing that an old-looking setting helped form character. Banks, libraries, and museums chose pointed profiles to signal stability and public trust, even when their interiors ran on elevators, hot water heating, and gas or electric light. The look seeped into the home and the book. Cabinet makers offered sideboards and chairs with tracery panels and linen-fold fronts. Dressmakers cut ecclesiastical motifs into lace and trim. Publishers framed title pages with crockets and cusps. Binders pressed arches and fleur-de-lis into leather. Wallpaper, tiles, and metalwork echoed the same vocabulary so that a parlor could stage a small version of a chapel bay, complete with stenciled borders and brass hinges shaped like miniature trefoils. Gothic never went silent in the modern era. It shifted mediums. Architects, filmmakers, designers, and subcultures kept reaching for its vertical pull, its shadows, and its charged symbolism. The pointed arch and the rib returned as visual shorthand for memory, authority, and a certain kind of mystery. Even when new materials took over, the outlines and rhythms learned from medieval workshops stayed useful because they organize space clearly and carry a story with a glance. Early 20th century builders tested that logic with steel frames and reinforced concrete. They stretched facades into tall, stepped masses that read like urban spires. Thin stone or terracotta screens stood in front of modern skeletons, turning mullions and tracery into cladding that could rise block after block. University campuses planned quadrangles with gate towers and perpendicular windows, then hid lecture halls with steel trusses behind those historic skins. The result made new infrastructure feel grounded without copying a single medieval detail outright. Cinema translated Gothic cues into light and shadow. Directors learned that tall openings, clustered columns, and vaulted ceilings build tension because they frame depth and conceal edges. Set designers borrowed arches, rib lines, and rose window motifs to stage corridors where a figure can move from bright to dark in a step. Horror films leaned on that geometry alongside angled light and fog, so the architecture taught the mood before a character spoke. Over time, those shapes became a library of signals that any viewer could read instantly. Outside the screen, subcultures reworked the aesthetic into personal style. The late 20th century Goth movement took black fabrics, lace, and metal fittings and arranged them like a wearable tracery. Musicians layered baritone voices and minor key progressions, echoing the weight and resonance of stone interiors. Writers folded medieval themes into contemporary plots, pilgrimages that turned to night walks, relics to heirlooms, cloisters to clubs. The effect tied past and present through texture and tone rather than replicas of forms. Meanwhile, original buildings needed care. Wars tore vaults and roofs, pollutants crusted facades and ate mortar. Conservation became a technical field. Chemists tested stone salts, engineers mapped thrusts, and craftsmen relearned lime mortars and hand-cut joints. Scaffolds went up not to add height, but to stabilize it. Teams cataloged every block, numbered tracery pieces, and reset them with stainless pins where iron had expanded. The aim was to keep the reading of the building intact while slowing the processes that threatened it. Digital tools changed how that work happens. Laser scans collected millions of points to capture a vault's true shape. Photogrammetry turns overlapping images into accurate surfaces. Architects model loads in software, test wind on pinnacles, and simulate thermal movement in glazing bars. Art historians tie data to carvings and windows so that every statue and pane has a measured location, a material profile, and a repair history. Students learn the craft on screens first, and then move to mock-ups and stone. This video has explored the Gothic Age from its origins to its lasting legacy. If you enjoyed this journey, you should subscribe to follow the next chapter in history.